All right. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. This is an internationalist teaching, the Fracture series. So we're hoping everyone is joining us from all over the world. My name is Sean Macheza, and I will be the moderator for today's session and for other future sessions. I would like to really welcome you to join us for this series set up by the Transnational Institute, where we've realized that, well, I don't know about you, but for all of us, there are many questions that have come up. We feel that the world is changing. There are multiple things going on. The fabric of the society that we're used to is is shaky. Things are moving around, and many people don't know exactly what is going on, and there is an overabundance of information out there about what's going on. So at TNI, we decided we're going to have a series of 8 internationalist teachings to try and really grasp the big issues that are going on in the world right now. So Fractures is an 8-week teaching series starting today, the 30th of April, until the 18th of June, to go beyond the headlines and really uncover the deeper forces that are shaping this moment. So we'll have leading thinkers from all across the globe, embedded in multiple different movements, who will be giving us their perspectives and helping us to really get a grasp of what's going on. My name is Sean Macheza. As I said, I'm with the Transnational Institute, and together with the team here, my colleague Nick Buxton, who is helping with the moderation in the background, my colleague Jess, who is our super user on Zoom, and my colleague Twyla Jenna, who is helping in the chat moderation. She'll say hello in the chat. And of course, the whole machine of the Transnational Institute working behind the scenes to really give you this moment and try to understand exactly what's going on. So it's not only the Transnational Institute, but it is also a whole series of partners that were working together who you can see on the screen: the Alternative Information Development Center, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, the APF, which is the Africa Europe, the APF, apologies. So a big thank you to our co-organizers who are helping us put all of this together. We've got a great series of great speakers lined up to give us a really deeper understanding of what's going on today. Aziz Rana is a professor of law at the Boston College Law School. His work focuses on how shifting notions of race, citizenship, and empire have shaped the United States' legal and political identity since its founding. His books include The Two Faces of American Freedom, published in 2014, and The Constitutional Bind: How Americans Came to Idolize a Document That Fails Them, published just last year in 2024. He's a frequent contributor to, among others, N+1, to the Jacobin, to Boston Review, and has had a great series on the Dig podcast this last month. I highly recommend you go listen to it. It goes in deep and it gives you a deeper understanding of exactly what's going on in this particular moment. Together with Aziz, we have Achin Vanaik, who really helped us by stepping up. I know those who have seen the adverts for this session, we're expecting to see Jayati Ghosh as part of the speakers. Unfortunately, due to last-minute developments, Jayati cannot join us. And Achin has really graciously stepped up to fill in that gap for us. Thank you so much, Achin. Achin is a TNI fellow, an associate, and he's a retired professor of international relations and former head of Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. He's a lifelong activist for nuclear disarmament and is an active member in the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace in India, and in the Indian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, working to pressure Israel to comply with international law. And we all know how important that is at this particular moment in particular. He's a founder of the Society for Marxist Studies, which holds 2-week-long residential schools for postgraduate students and social activists from across India and often from across the world. And our third interlocutor will be Ho-Fung Hung, who is a professor in political economy at Johns Hopkins University. He received his bachelor's degree from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and his scholarly interests include global political economy, protest, nation-state formation, social theory, and East Asian development. He's the author of several books, including Clash of Empires, From Chimerica to the New Cold War, written in 2022, published in 2022, and China and the Transformation of Global Capitalism, 2011, published. So these are our three main speakers, and we will also have a colleague from the Transnational Institute, Luciana Ghiotto, who is going to come and give her own perspectives on exactly the issue that we're talking about today. And I will introduce Luciana when she comes in to speak in the second session of today's series. So, hello to everyone. Please make friends in the chat. Please get to know each other, because we would like people to communicate in the chat, and we would like people to ask questions. If you have a question to ask specifically to the to our discussants today, please put them in the Q&A section. But if you're just sharing information and having a sort of cross conversation also in the background, please do use the chat. We will take questions mainly from the Q&A section on the Zoom. So please use that part. Right now, we just want to get a quick poll, just like a quick understanding. Like I said, everyone's confused and everyone's trying to understand what's going on at this particular moment. Is the world falling apart? And the falling apart seems to be starting at the United States. So how do you, as where you stand right now, whichever part of the world you are, how do you view the United States turn towards reactionary nationalism? This is what we're seeing, what's happening right now. The United States has shirked the global order and decided to go on a very different path than many people expected, or maybe some already had expected. We may feel multiple things, but what do you feel about it? Do you feel hopeful? Is this like, well, the neoliberal US order was unjust and maybe it has to fall apart anyway, and this is what's happening? It's ready to be broken? Or are you feeling worried that the US turn to the right will lead to global fascism and war? Is that what's going to happen? Like many, you might be feeling confused, like don't know what to think. It's complicated. And perhaps none of these options sum up what you think. But we're really curious to get a global understanding of how people are dealing with this particular moment. So you might feel multiple of these different options, but please choose one and participate in the poll, and it'll help us understand exactly what the overall vibe is in our particular movement. How are people feeling? And maybe to kick that off, before we go into the deep questions of today's session, which is the changes in the global order, in the neoliberal global order. Maybe panelists, how do you feel about this one? How do you feel about this US turn towards reactionary nationalism? Maybe let's start with Aziz, real quick.
So, I mean, I should say that I'm deeply, deeply concerned, but at the same time, I think there's some space for, if not optimism, glimmers of hope. So the reason why I'm both deeply concerned and I feel like there's maybe some space for glimmers of hope is because, in a way, what we've seen since 2008 is really the breakdown of the global economic order that was predicated on the free movement of capital and profound constraints on labor. And that since the financial crisis, it's been pretty clear that that order cannot sustain itself. The problem, and this is not just a US problem, is that the far right and a populist right has just been much more equipped to manage the crisis of the political center, because the last half century plus has seen a real attack on the institutions of the left. So domestic and transnational labor, as well as a whole host of other institutions. And the US in this way is no different. So that you have a situation where the right was able to take advantage of this collapse in the center. The reason why I'd say that I'm hopeful both for the world and then also in the US specifically is that reactionary right-wing politics, even though it has a strong base, is not a majority in the United States. And indeed, the policies of folks like Trump are deeply, deeply unpopular. And then even beyond that, it's just the fact that if the center's project is collapsing, the right has no alternative to offer besides xenophobia and scapegoating. And really, it's only the left and the forces, both domestically and transnationally, of an internationalist left that provide a kind of pathway out of this thicket. And it's that fact that offers some space for hope, despite all of the really troubling dynamics of the present.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aziz. Achin, what are your thoughts?
Well, this turn towards reactionary nationalism is something that's taking place not just in the United States, but globally. And insofar it is global, then the obvious primary explanatory principle itself has to be global. And that, of course, is the turn towards neoliberal economics and all its effects on democratic rights, world inequality, oligarchic capital becoming more and more important, and so on. And things have taken a turn for the worse after the Great Recession of 2008-9. And therefore, in the short term, I am pessimistic. It is worrying. What will happen as a result of this is that there are going to be upheavals of different kinds in different ways. Those upheavals are going to be right-wing upheavals in resistance to what's happened, the unfortunate thing, and they're also going to be left-wing upheavals. Insofar as some of those left-wing upheavals are going to get some of their demands achieved, or in fact lead to a change in government, which is a much more left populist and progressive direction, then that creates the basis for more optimism. But it's an open-ended question. The crucial question will be the degree of political activism and the direction that that takes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Achin. And Ho-Fung, what are your sentiments?
Yeah, I'm as much worrying about the situation as everybody else here, I guess, but also at the same time, I always need to stifle my own pessimism by reminding myself that like Trump is in office in 100 days only. And in this era of social media and TikTok and thing, we still seems to tend to have the kind of attention cycle faster than before, but in the kind of a longer term of things. And I can see that a lot of things is already happening but Trump just like do it in a very exaggerated way and caught our attention. For example, that the U.S. complaining about its allies in Europe not paying up, and actually it has stayed back to JFK. Even at the height of Berlin crisis, you look at the JFK presidential archive that Kennedy is already complaining the West Germans are not paying up and then secretly threatening to withdraw U.S. troops and saying that we don't care about whether you become communist or not, that just pay up. But now that Trump is saying something that used to be behind closed door, up and open, and then in a dramatic way, we just suddenly pay attention to it. And in terms of the tariff, it's very interesting because like the retreat from neoliberalism and global free trade has started, as Aziz pointed out, that after the global financial crisis in 2008, the whole system is collapsing slowly. And from Obama's second term, with all this Buy American costs in this stimulus money, to Trump one, and then to Biden, we all see this kind of slow retreating from free trade. And now that with this grand tariff, everybody's criticizing it. Interestingly, that people, for the sake of the argument, that they criticize it as if they are nostalgic about free trade and neoliberalism and things like that. But I'm not sure whether it is actually thing that we need to hope about. So the real crisis is really a lot like the trend right now that Trump is accelerating, but also the real crisis is the lack of alternative imagination. That on the liberals, among the left, that we have a knee-jerk reaction to what Trump has been doing. But it sounds like, for example, the Democrats, it sounds like that what they are hoping is to go back to like 10 years ago, as if all the Trump 1 and 2 haven't happened. But it is not going to work. That's definitely. So what I am hopeful about is that this acceleration of crisis might eventually invoke a kind of a real thinking about what is the alternative that we want.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all our three speakers. And I think already just your these first contributions, your sentiments already show exactly what was the motivation behind this series, because and then behind the naming of the series, naming it fractures, because what we're seeing is indeed a sort of breaking of the global system. There are things that are tearing apart, there are things that are falling apart, but at the same time, as you just said, Ho-Fung, for alternative imagination, where is the light coming in from through these fractures, and what opportunity does it give us to really imagine an alternative reality and put together a global world with equity, justice, and really better living for all of humanity? They sound like crazy goals, but that's why we're here, and that's why we set our goals on the horizon. So thank you very much for these initial contributions. Now let's get deeper into it. Let's really understand exactly what is going on, and let's sift through all this noise that we've been getting in the media and really lock it down. Aziz, you've studied U.S. imperialism. This is your a big part of the work that you've done, and I'd like you to maybe answer two particular questions for us. The first being, why is U.S. imperialism in the form that it took in the United States, why is it critical to understanding international politics, and in particular international politics today? And is what we're seeing with Donald Trump is a tendency? Does it suggest that there's a break with this imperialism, or at least a sort of remaking of it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that obviously the US is not the only state with an imperial project. There are many different versions of imperialism that are state projects globally that we can articulate and describe. But the reason why it's valuable to focus on the dynamics of American statecraft and the American project is because the US, really since World War II, has been the globally dominant hegemon or superpower, and it's played a central role in establishing the international legal, political, and economic system that's operated since then, and that it has an outsized function in both the maintenance and the potential breakdown of that system. And in a way, I think we can make sense of both of those questions by thinking about three different moments in time in the evolution of American politics. So the late 19th century, the mid 20th century, and the present. If we were looking at American power in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the US was basically a regional settler polity in the Americas. In other words, it was a product of Anglo-European settlement, primarily, though not exclusively, from England in the Americas, and that was organized around a set of legal and political practices that distinguished between the rights and opportunities provided to settler insiders as opposed to those that were excluded or subordinated communities. In particular, it was organized around territorial expansion, so the expropriation of indigenous land, combined with the use of coerced labor, especially enslaved Black labor, in order to be able to ensure internal economic growth and wealth, as well as economic independence and political participation for insiders. This produced an expanding and quite powerful state, but within the terms of the Americas. And then what happens over the course of the first half of the 20th century is that the US increasingly emerges onto the global stage once the frontier is effectively closed or completed. There's no new indigenous land to expropriate and transform. As part of this transformation to, let's say, a global standing, the US is confronting the fact that the world is also transforming. So in the first half of the 20th century, there are two global wars, World War I, World War II. These global wars put incredible amounts of pressure on what had been the defining features of the international system. And those defining features are really the fact that it was marked by European imperial rivalry. So mercantilist economic policies, zero-sum competition over land, resources, territory, power. These two wars meant that whoever wins them, you're still subject to profound breakdowns in the capacity to assert power. England might have been victorious after these two world wars, but can't really sustain its own imperial authority. And all of that is taking place against the backdrop of rising non-white political assertiveness across the colonized world, or what we today describe as the global South. And the US effectively becomes a global hegemon in this backdrop of the collapse of the European imperial system and a world marked by decolonization. And as part of its rise to power, as a result, there's also a transformation in the domestic assessment of the meaning of the American project. What American policymakers end up doing is they claim certain types of anti-slavery national narratives from the 19th century that present the country as standing for certain universal principles connected to the Declaration of Independence, so that the country stands for universal principles of equality and liberty, and that they link this to an account of market capitalism, to a vision of liberal constitutionalism, and to an assertion that the U.S. is exceptional because it's the place where these principles came down to earth. And the meaning of its project is both the promotion of those principles domestically, but the promotion of them globally as well, so that American interests are essentially coextensive with the world's interests. This is a way of articulating American power as legitimate in a global world marked by decolonization and increasingly the equal sovereignty of states, regardless of their racial background or previous colonized status. All of this ends up shaping the international system that the U.S. spearheads in the mid-20th century. So it's an international system predicated on independent nation states, multilateral institutions, the quote-unquote rules-based order. But that international system has a critical caveat, which is American officials say that for it to function, there has to be some actor that can step inside, but then also outside of the legal arrangements to ensure that stability proceeds, markets are functioning, states are operating consistent with American judgments about what statecraft should be. And this is a continual justification for the U.S. and the U.S. exclusively exercising what you can think of as an international police power to assert authority to reconstruct the domestic relations of foreign states, especially foreign states in the previously colonized world, as well as to pick and choose when it's going to abide by the very legal international arrangements, human rights law, et cetera, that the U.S. was central in establishing. And this is why throughout the second half of the 20th century, American statecraft and the American imperial project, because it asserts this international police power, was marked by this persistent debate about whether or not the U.S. was living up to its values. Because in practice, oftentimes, the justification for essentially engaging in various types of interventions, overthrowing governments, supporting coups, was that this was necessary for the system as a whole. And this can read like hypocrisy. But in truth, it was a type of instability built into the order, where the nature of the order was one in which there's a rules-based framework and a near continuous American defection, picking and choosing about when to abide by that framework. So that's the longue durée. And then we have this moment. The one additional thing that's critical to appreciate about how we got from the mid-20th century to this moment is the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The desire to win hearts and minds vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century plays a significant role in American domestic reform projects. It pushes back against Jim Crow and segregation domestically, because how could the U.S. lead a global world that's overwhelmingly non-white if it's engaged in various kinds of apartheid practices at home? And it also has this effect of pushing the American center-left and the American center-right, both toward greater respect for constitutional limits domestically, toward an appreciation for the need for some version of a social welfarist framework, economically regulative framework that would constrain some of the worst excesses of market capitalism and business. And then also for a willingness to engage in respect for those international rules that the U.S. might have set up. But what happens basically when the Soviet Union collapses is that the right in the U.S. systematically defects from this larger compact. We think of the Cold War, rightly, as asserting a huge amount of suppressive power vis-a-vis the left, repression of the left. But one of the things that the Cold War did is it also led the center-right to contain elements of its far right. And in the U.S., basically, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the far right has become increasingly more dominant as the kind of socially cohesive pressures to contain it have become more limited. And then there are also very specific dynamics of the American electoral system that are highly unrepresentative of general popular sentiment. And because the representational system is built on overrepresenting small population centers where the far right is especially powerful, it means that the far right can assert more political control than what its general popular support might be. And all of this leads to the rise of Trump, the failure to be able to contain Trump even when he attempts to overthrow the government, the failure to keep him off the ballot, to criminally prosecute him, and then his return in this present moment. And what we're seeing right now is essentially a far right that never was committed to the terms of the mid-century compact, to that vision of the country as fulfilling a very specific kind of account of redemption from an anti-slavery tradition that's incorporating folks globally, that has a vision of some degree of control over market capitalism. So you have a far right that was never committed to that project, that is unleashed and is systematically trying to take apart all of its elements: racial liberalism, constraints on market capitalism, protections for speech and certain kinds of civil libertarian protections, constraints on executive power, where executive power had been something that you assert aggressively in the international space but might be limited domestically. Now you're claiming that kind of imperial presidency even for the domestic politics. And in this way, it's absolutely an attack on the terms of mid-century American global authority, the imperial project from the mid-century. And you can see this in trying to take apart things like USAID, which was itself a Cold War institution meant to win hearts and minds in the global South, the desire to defect entirely from international legal constraints. And so on the one hand, this is a break. One should note the politics, for instance, in places like Gaza highlights how defection from rules following was always part of the mid-century project. But here we have a much more thoroughgoing defection. Yet on the other hand, it's not necessarily a break from the idea of the US as an imperial power. What it really more closely resembles is a return to a vision of the country as a specific kind of settler hegemon, where it's not concerned with the types of soft power associated with winning hearts and minds in the global South. Instead, it really thinks of the world in Manichaean us versus them terms, marked by zero-sum, mercantilist competition between various rivals, and understands American authority as built around the extent to which it can just promote and impose hard power. Hence the invocations of McKinley, presidents from the late 19th century, discussions of Greenland, talks about the Panama Canal, Canada as a 51st state, or even the framework around a place like Ukraine, where the U.S. is basically interested in carving up Ukraine with Russia, where Russia gets territory, with the war presumably ending, while the U.S. would enjoy getting mineral access and various kinds of material benefits, or the fact that you're now rejecting even the fig leaf of any kind of legality with respect to the types of constraints you might, in theory, if not in practice, impose on states like Israel.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Aziz. I hear you saying the key part that I'm getting is really there's a sort of taking off of the mask. There's been a pretense at following the rules-based order, and then now for some reason there's no longer the need to put on that mask in that particular way.
So I think it's a little bit deeper than that, because it is also the case that if you think about why do people like the Obamas and the Bushes feel kinship? They actually believed, and they believe very deeply in the mid-century project of the rules-based order. They understand the country as exceptional, as its interests equivalent to the world's interests. They see the country as having struggled, fought for those principles. And so there is, in fact, an ideological transformation that did take place among the political elite that Trump and the people around Trump, like an extreme set of right-wing loyalists, reject. And in a way, like, the Trump folks are in opposition to the American 20th century. And so in this sense, it is a profound break, but it's continuous with some of the underlying instabilities and practices of violence that marked the American 20th century. And it's continuous with the long array of what we can think of as settler politics that persisted in having a strong grasp on elements of the American right, but that had been kind of contained or suppressed. It's like a return to a much more explicitly ethno-nationalist vision of the country.
Thanks so much, Aziz. I'll move to you, Ho-Fung. First, indeed, what are your thoughts on Aziz's perspective? And perhaps a more direct question to you is, how has China's economic ascendancy in this last 20th century, that was the United States century, and of course in this new century, how has this shaped this current geopolitical moment? And are we now looking at a war of empires? Is that what's happening? Is it a hegemonic vacuum now with the US retreating to its reactionary nationalism, or something else? What are we looking at?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I agree very much. I'm glad that Aziz bring back the longue durée and historical perspective. I just want to build upon it to talk about the political economy behind this, because the American empire since the 19th century and early 20th century has two phases. Is on the one hand, it's different from the British Empire. That the British Empire is built on the practice and ideology of free trade, like when Britain tried to trade with China. China initially in the early 19th century refused to trade, and then they for the Opium War to break open China market for British goods and also for French goods, for American goods, for all other core countries' goods. So free trade is the foundational ideology of the British Empire. And the American Empire, as late Liu Panich always pointed out, that it's grounded not as much on free trade, but on free movement of capital. First American capital, but also after the US become a global hegemon, it also tried to guarantee the freedom of movement for its allies' capital in Japan and in Europe. So what America has been caring about is the world is open, offer freedom. What the ideology of freedom in the American founding ideology is not much about individual freedom, but the freedom of capital, that I can invest in wherever I want and make money wherever I want for American corporation and also other transnational corporation around the world. So this is one thing. So it is why after the Second World War, US put up a kind of a phase of a progressive hegemon to persuade and pressure its European allies to give up its colonies, because this British Empire is actually this restricting American capital and corporation to go to these territories controlled by the British Empire, French Empire. So decolonization is actually working for the benefits of American capital. After decolonization, then of course that is a competition with the Soviet Union too. So they worry that they will.
Ho-Fung, could you slow down a little bit? People in the chat
sure.
say they're having trouble following.
Okay, so what I'm saying that this American imperialism from the early 20th century has been built on this ideology of freedom for capital. So it is why in the mid 20th century, the US advocate decolonization and pressuring its European allies to give up its colonies, because this autarkic empire is actually not working for the interests of American corporation. After decolonization, this newly independent country can become a new fertile playground for American corporation to go to instead of British corporation or French corporation. So this freedom of capital is really the foundational to American capitalism and empire. The second form of American empire is a more kind of atavistic form of empire that, as it pointed out, that Trump tried to revive, is this annexation of contiguous territory, that is territories next to US. So that's in the 19th century, America has expansion into the West, into the Wild West, and also the annexations of Mexican territory and turn it into California. Of course, there's Alaska and all other places. The thing is that one thing is that Trump is saying what they want to do, but in the long run, in 3 years, 4 years, 10 years, we will see how much he can accomplish. And the good news for me or for all of us is that my speculation is that the way that Trump talk about it and do about it and actually undermine what they want to do, because the talk about Greenland has been in the foreign policy elite circle quietly. for quite a while because of the strategic importance of Greenland, of the melting of the North Pole, opening up of this Liu kind of shipping route, shipping lane in, around the North Pole, and also the critical minerals suddenly become available. So American foreign policy elite has been quietly talking about how U.S. can kind of take control of Greenland one way or other quietly, with the Denmark and things like that. But now Trump make it public and talk about it in a kind of very bullying way. So I think it actually make it more difficult for U.S. to actually take control of the Greenland. And you already see it in Panama Canal that the Hong Kong Chinese company that own the ports in the canal originally had a deal with American corporation to sell it, but then it make China very unhappy, and then China actually stopped the transaction, and now that is still in limbo. That the port is still in the hands of the Hong Kong Chinese company. And Canada is also another example that the talk about this improbable annexation of Canada just empowered the liberals in the recent election, that the conservative, which could have been the MAGA allies in Canada, has a real chance to win before that. But after the Trump this talk about making Canada a new state, just antagonized many Canadians, that the electoral landscape shift, and then the liberal won, and then and we'll see what happened next. So this kind of a American empire in the form of annexation of contagious territory might not work in the end, because that how Trump do it. But then the agenda of keeping the world open for American capital is very much alive, because it's coincide with the interest of American capital, and it has been the foundational conflict between China and the U.S. because in the age of what people call Chimerica, that because in early 2000s people think that China and America become too integrated, so integrated that we can regard them as one integrated economy. So the conservative economist historian Leo Ferguson invented the term Chimerica to describe this integrated formation. So at that time, American capital and these conservative thinkers think that the best scenario of the world order is that China is open up for American capital, and American market is open up for free trade from Chinese goods. So Apple can make iPhone in China and then export back to the US and around the world, and Caterpillar can leave the US and an open factory, and actually they did, to make construction machine and sell it back to the US and then sell it to all over the world. So they don't care about Chinese goods taking over the US market, so far as these Chinese goods were manufactured by US capital or the subsidiary of US capital. In the case of iPhone, it was manufactured by a Taiwanese company called Foxconn, that the subcontractor of Apple. So the American capital don't care about the Chinese good flooding the US market, because in the end, it is them who reap most of the profit. So far as China is open for American capital to go there to export the labor there, so that they can escape from the organized unionized labor in the US and elsewhere, and then to make things in China and then export the thing back to the US and around the world. So it is the happy scenario for capital and for all these conservative establishment thinkers back in the 1990s and 2000. So American capital free to go to China and make stuff and conquer the world with the cheap manufactured goods, with American technology and American capital. But thing didn't happen develop the way that American capital or the conservative thinkers and politicians imagine, because after a while that many Chinese company master the technology of making those stuff. So there's acquisition of illegal technology transfer, legitimate or illegitimate one, but the reality is that many Chinese corporations master the technology themselves and start to make stuff themselves. They no longer that much relying on American capital to make those phones, like Huawei making the cell phone, and a lot of the Chinese state-owned or private construction machine company that make the construction machine that is look exactly the same as Caterpillar, but like half the price of Caterpillar. But that this kind of Chinese capital start to exploit their own Chinese labor and then make goods to compete with American capital, American products in the Belt and Road country, in the global South, in Asia. So it is the why the American capital suddenly become very unhappy about China, because China is no longer a kind of a labor provider only, but because also that China become a kind of competitor. They have their homegrown capital to make stuff that compete with U.S. products around the world. So it is the foundation of the U.S.-China competition. It is not about ideology. It's not about political system, because the political system has been different since like long time ago, but it didn't prevent U.S. and China to get into very good relation in the 1990s and 2000s. But all of a sudden, particularly after the global financial crisis, American capital suddenly realized that they have a China problem, that the Chinese capital used to be their partner, become their competitor, first in Chinese market, then in the global South, and then in Europe, in many other third countries market. So it is the foundation of the U.S.-China conflict. And then the latest Trump trade war is a kind of a way attempt, maybe successful, maybe not, maybe half success, to address this issue for the American capital. How it play out, again, that Trump has been in office in 100 days. All this chaos, whether it is real chaos or whether it is a strategy for negotiation, I don't know. We need to see. But the political economy is very clear that the American empire, based on this practice and ideology of making the world, keeping the world free for American corporation and free for American capital to move around, to exploit labor in different places and to big business, hasn't changed. And we'll see what happened from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ho-Fung. So fundamental changes afoot, definitely big shifts and big fractures in the global order. What impact will this have, Achin, to come to you very quickly? This moment of heightened reactionary nationalism that we're seeing in political and economic competition between these countries, what does this mean for the global South? I mean, it's broadly defined, of course. And can the global South really be a collective agent for progressive change in this particular moment?
Okay. Let me just add something to both what Aziz and Ho-Fung have said. And I agree with both their Aziz's analysis of the historical trajectory and Ho-Fung's emphasis on the importance of the freedom of movement of American capital and global capital, one of the central characteristics of the neoliberal turn. And in the case of the United States, even earlier. I think if we want to understand the geopolitics of today, as compared to the geopolitics earlier, I think we must emphasize something that talk of the new Cold War versus the old Cold War tends to miss. And that is that earlier on, there was a systemic divide between capitalist countries and non-capitalist countries like the Soviet Union and China. What has happened now is that you can no longer talk about Soviet Union or Russia or China as capitalist countries, although China is not a neoliberal order, but it is definitely capitalist here. And that means that contrary to what certain sections of the left unfortunately think, you have to recognize that both Russia and China are imperialist powers in their own way, even though, of course, the United States is the big daddy there. But this change from a systemic divide into something different, if you like, and they're all being nuclearly armed, means that there's a greater degree of flexibility in the relationships they have with each other. And unlike in the First World War period, you can't talk about armed struggle between them and all going here. That era is also over. You've had decolonization, you have different ways of making money and all the rest of it there. But this, I think, is very, very important to understand. And therefore, China could be a strategic partner for a considerable time and then moves towards being a competitor, then moves towards being a rival, and now being seen as a strategic enemy. So you have a certain degree of flexibility there. And Trump adds his own dimension in the sense that upset with the kind of costs of maintaining the American hegemony elsewhere, he's insisting on the Europeans doing much more, and also on Japan and Australia doing much more. But he is shifting, if you like, towards saying that my areas of importance, which I want to dominate, is a shift to the Pacific and the containment of China. Even though I'm open to doing economic deals if necessary with them. Yeah. So what you have is the situation. Incidentally, there's a geopolitics dimension of what Trump is doing with Ukraine, in the sense that he's indicating that, look, Russia, I'm not opposed to you having your sphere of influence. Why do you get too close to the Chinese? Whether that's going to work out or not is a different case. But my point here is that the geopolitics today is much more in terms of Trump having his own sphere of influence, Russia having his own sphere of influence, the Chinese wanting a more territorial sphere of influence, but there's a little bit of a problem for them in the sense that the Southeast Asian countries are integrated economically with China. They do not fear a land invasion. China represses Uyghurs and Tibetans. Its more militaristic imperialism is much more in the South China Seas. And of course, it's seeking through the BRI to have extended influence here. But okay, this is Trump and he wants to move in that direction. So that's the economic political. You asked me the question about the collective, the response of the South and what the South can do here. Well, there's a lot of talk now about multipolarity. I would be very, very cautious about this. You have three big powers. The talk of multipolarity is really a kind of response to the fact that there are a number of middle powers. India would like to be a bigger power, but it's basically a middle power. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, South Africa, so on. Middle powers trying to extend their own influence. They are in part sub-imperial powers, aspiring regional hegemons, aspiring imperialist powers, and so on. And they would like to be able to maneuver between the big three, if you like, to extend their own influence. But please recognize that none of these are a serious challenger to the big three. In fact, they're aligned in one way or the other, more to one side than the other, mostly with the West. Yeah. So I think that's one thing to recognize. The point about emphasizing these middle powers and all is to recognize that when we talk about a collective global South response to what is happening, be very, very careful. Once upon a time, there used to be talk about the new international economic order. There was something called the G77, which even today is supposed to represent 134 countries. And you had these middle powers that were supposed to be the natural leaders because they were stronger and more influential for the G77, the 100 Global South. What has actually happened? They've been absorbed into the G20, which is where they actually work with the Western powers, Europe and the United States of America. And of course, that's much more important to them than the G77. Most of the Global South are much weaker countries, Africa, elsewhere, Latin America, and so on. Are they really bothered about them, etc.? And the other area, of course, is BRICS, in which you have them coming in, which is now extended to 10. BRICS difference from G20 is that Europe and the United States is not in there. But do you really expect BRICS or the G20 to be, or these countries which are middle powers and all, to be serious advocates of the need and concerns of the vast majority of the Global South countries? In fact, what's actually happening is that even within these Global South weaker countries, you have elites which are prepared to make connections with all kinds in order to be able to oppress their own public and to try to move towards having greater oligarchic wealth for themselves, to be able to benefits of various kinds. Who are they caring about? The real problems of the globals, of their own populations and elsewhere. So this is a really terrible situation. And what does BRICS say? Well, BRICS says that we are moving against here. And let's forget about the capacity of BRICS, for example, to play any kind of a serious political role in opposition to the West. India and China are there. Yeah. You've got new entrants of UAE and Egypt. Do you know that UAE and Egypt are on opposite sides in the civil war in Sudan? Do you really expect any of these countries, Iran and Egypt, to be working together? Saudi Arabia will come in here? Forget it. So politically, no. What is the economic value of BRICS? To a limited extent, it has extended the capacity for trade and investment in local currency and so on. But in terms of trying to move towards a de-dollarization, etc., it has basically gone very little. Over 70% of their loans and all are in dollars. You have, what can I say? Do you know today, 25 years ago, the proportion of dollars in the world currency reserves was something like 70%. 25 years later, dollars are now 60%. Do you know what is second? Eurozone. And where does China come in? Sixth. Just about 2.3 or something, about the same as Canada currency being part of world reserves. And Canada's economy is 1/8 of that of China. I could go on and on about the situation, but the point I'm trying to make is that even economically, to consider BRICS to be a serious opponent to or leader for the global South's concern is simply not on. I don't want to take too much time. I've only got 10 minutes, but I want to draw the point is that if you're going to talk about change global South, what in fact is the BRICS saying? BRICS saying to the African countries, oh, let's work together, you move away from the West and all that. And you know what's actually happening? The countries within BRICS are competing with each other in collaboration with different African elites in different countries to loot Africa of all kinds of resources and support. And who cares about the poor in Africa? And this is a body that is going to lead and fight for the South. What is my point? My point is that we live in a world in which the corporate elites, I mean, Marx talked about workers of the world unite. In fact, what's happening in many ways is that the what should I say? The capitalists of the world unite. You have nothing to lose, certainly not your privileges. Of course, there are variations, this thing here. But you actually have a situation in which oligarchic wealth and greater concentration is taking place in different countries. There are opportunities for others to come in and so on. Yeah, but they're not really bothered about the conditions there. So which is the way forward? And the way forward, in a certain sense, is that we have to recognize that we live in a world of multiple nation states. And as reactionary as nationalism is, it makes it even more important to fight for some forms of progressive nationalism, even while recognizing that there are limits to progressive nationalism and there are no limits to reactionary nationalism. Reactionary nationalism is more powerful in many ways, but the only way to fight it is through progressive nationalist movements of various kinds. And that can be the prelude, and if it's successful, towards making more international connections on the working class, of progressive movements on the climate change and so on, to move towards, because we have to address universal problems. Because this fight between the different imperialisms is not going to resolve basic problems. It's not even going to lead to domination of a dominant, increasingly dominant kind for one or the other. It's creating chaos and problems here. So that fight at the national level to actually bring about some kind of progressive change as a step towards fighting on a more collective basis for that is very much there. And if these are successful in some of the bigger and more important countries, then of course that leaves opportunity for really moving forward here. And let me end by just saying that if you really want to take an example or a test case of what these different middle powers and these leaders of the global South and others are doing, let's take Gaza. Let me point out that the number one supplier of coal to Israel is Russia. The number two supplier, in spite of the good things it's doing in the ICJ, is South Africa. India's government's relationship to Gaza is despicable. They're providing arms and they're providing there. The Chinese made it very clear that they're not part of G77 from the very beginning. They said, we will give you money and we will support your declarations, but we're not part of it. And the Chinese have said, as far as Gaza is concerned here, oh, we want no unilateral question, a multilateral. And do you think China is going to sacrifice the fact that it is the number one exporting country to Israel? The USA is number two. That the exporting country to Israel, they're going to have serious trade sanctions on them. No, as for the Arab countries, has the Abraham Accord anybody moved away from that? Has they been using the oil weapon? So my point about the question of the global south and collective wealth, forget it. You're talking about having to fight from below, particularly at the progressive national level, and if there are breakthroughs, they are here. In many cases, the pathway as far as Gaza and the Palestinians concerned will travel through the other Arab countries. The famous statement about if you want to liberate the Palestinians, the pathway is through Amman and Cairo. And in many respects, that's very true. You have to connect that struggle to struggles to overthrow that here. I'm sorry, I'm perhaps taking too much time. My apologies.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Achin. Thank you for that really sobering analysis and really emphasizing the need for it. It has to come from below. It will have to be our activism that changes anything, and we have to continue on this process. For those who may have joined after we introduced, this is the Fractures Teach-In series created by the Transnational Institute. And our idea is really to understand what are the fractures going on in the global system and where are some points of light coming through that may help us solve the current moment, at least to understand it. And we've had these amazing speakers who've given us quite a lot to digest. But at the Transnational Institute, we also look at these issues continuously, issues on trade and investment, amongst all the many other different things we look at. And I'd like to call in my colleague who we work with, the TNI, Luciana Ghiotto, who's an associate researcher with the Transnational Institute, and she specializes on trade and investment, which is a big part of what we're talking about today. So I'd like to invite her. She's a researcher in CONICET, Argentina, and a professor of international political economy at the Universidad Nacional de San Martin, UNSAM. Forgive my Spanish. Ms. Ghiotto is also a member of Attack Argentina and coordinator of the Argentine Better Without Free Agreements Assembly. So, Luciana, let's take it down to your own work. How do these issues relate to your own area of work right now? What questions is it raising, and how are you addressing it in your general work, all the stuff we're talking about?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everybody. What a privilege to be here in this debate. I wanted to use my small time that I have here to share with you some of the things that were so interesting that were brought to the table and that are super useful to understand at what moment we are now. And this will relate in my second part of what I want to talk about is on how this affects trade and investment movements and CSOs that have been working on the trade agenda for the past 30 years probably now. So first of all, I wanted to bring some of the elements that we have been seeing in the past weeks, month probably, since Trump went forward with these Liberation Day tariffs. And some of the things have been mentioned here, but it's really interesting to see how the liberal part of the media, of the academics, also analysts, have been dealing with these trade issues. And we are seeing again this moment of the ends and the crisis, right? Like in the early 90s, when the USSR went down and everybody was saying, well, this is the end of history, this is the end of capitalism as we knew it, or this idea of having two powers in capitalism. Now we have the winner is the US, and this is the end of class struggle, this isn't the end of the state, this is the end of the working class. And now we see that again. How? Well, this is the end of globalization, the end of neoliberal era, this is the end of we're seeing the decoupling and the crisis of the liberal order. And so we start wondering, well, is it really that we are seeing the end of all of this? How did we understand globalization in the first place? And this is super important because it has to do with the political strategies that come from analysis. So in the first place, things that have been said here that are super important. Well, this is not new. I mean, protectionism, as Aziz Rana has said, protectionism has been going on in the US for 150 years. I mean, Professor Chang already said this idea of kicking away the ladder, right? They have used protectionism to strengthen the part of imperialism and the part of hegemony from the US in order to have capitalism that is useful for them and the corporations that they have. And this is not new. And this is not even new now in 2025, we have seen this going on in the past 8 years with the first government of Donald Trump. And we have also seen that this is a bipartisan consensus in a way, as it has been said before, because we have seen in Biden doing exactly the same thing. So this idea of going forward with tariffs is something that will remain. So, but is this new? What is this? What's going on with this? How do we analyze this? Is this the end of globalization? And in this sense, I think that we have to acknowledge the contradiction, the paradox that the US is in. Trump is right in a way when he says, and I usually say this is not very nice to say, but Trump is right. I mean, he's pointing out the impacts of globalization in the territory of the US. We have seen how since NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the industrial jobs have been lost in the US and capitals have fled from the US. As John Holloway would say, this idea of flying away from what? From very expensive work, from very indisciplined work, from more and more strikes on capitals in the 60s, in the 70s, from seeing profit going down. So this is what corporations fled from. They created China at the same time as Ho-Fung was saying before. They created China, they created the superpower, but it's in the center of the discussion what you have to acknowledge, that this contradiction of showing the effects of globalization, but at the same time seeing China go up. What we see there is that this contradiction shows that Trump is in a kind of a cage, in a kind of problem, because corporations are at the same time what have made the hegemony of the US, the corporations have made the US great. So this idea of, well, but what happened with this corporation? These corporations created the internationalization of capital, flying away from this expensive work and going to the Southeast Asia. And now what we see is the paradox of trying to bring them back. But that is what makes America big in the first place and powerful in the first place as a huge economy, right? And then another part to this, and this relates directly to TNI's work in the last years also, is that what we saw with these corporations and with this US power that Trump is now criticizing, and free trade, he's criticizing the neoliberal order, but that was related to the creation of a legal global architecture that became part of our lives in the last 30 years, which is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The free trade agreements, we have over 200 free trade agreements in the world, and the bilateral investment treaties with ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, that has been a great part of the heart of these corporations, the power of corporations globally. So this is something that is not changing so happily as the liberal analysts are saying in these days, that we're witnessing the end of globalization. We're not witnessing the end of corporate power. As Professor Achin was saying before, what we're seeing on the contrary is that they are waiting, and they feel the uncertainty. So we are probably going to see more crises coming on our way. And we have seen that already this past month with Trump announcing huge tariffs, but then going back, well, maybe not for Apple, maybe not for techs. Now he's saying maybe not for all automotive, the car industry also. So he's analyzing exceptions to that because corporations are afraid the situation is going to change, but they are going to see the way not to lose as much as they are foreseeing that it could happen in the future. So to finish this, what will happen to our strategies? What happens to on our side? On our side, what we see is that probably, and I feel this after 25 years of being in the anti-free trade agreements campaigns, what we see is that we have to go even further. We have to radicalize even more. We cannot, as trade movements, keep pushing only on the trade agenda, because what we have seen with all the analysis that has been ongoing here in this debate, but also with people like Yanis Varoufakis, showing the importance of seeing the financial sector also, and to see what happens with the power of the dollar. That is something that usually the CSOs that relate to trade and investment agenda, we don't usually look at that. We just look at WTO, we look at the trade agreements, but that is just a little part of what's going on right now. So we have to, first of all, radicalize more, because the far right is radicalizing, and we have to say no to FTAs, but taking into account that these free trade agreements are much more than just tariffs. They are corporate power centered, and that is what we have to keep fighting in the next years.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Luciana. Luciana works with the Transnational Institute, and I saw our panelists paying close attention. Aziz, what did you pick from Luciana's contribution that really stood out for you? I in particular like the fact that the United States empire made China, and now has a problem with China. I don't know what's your thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I suppose a couple of very quick things, which is first that, you know, there's a clear kind of self-interest in the construction of rules. And one of like the classic questions about the nature of any of these rules-based orders, including the rise of so-called globalization, was the extent to which the sort of the central moving state here, the US, is willing to be bound by rules even when it's not in its immediate self-interest. And that part of really the story that well precedes Trump is the steady defection of any set of circumstances in which self-interest is actually constrained. And you can see this with the fact that the US, you know, plays a central role, for instance, in the construction of the WTO, and then effectively ends up creating a whole range of bilateral agreements to avoid actually being bound by the terms of what it would say would be like an international trade framework. And so this is a story that's not, again, as Luciana was saying, that's a Trump-specific story, but it's one that has its long continuity. The other thing that I'd say that I thought Luciana really hit the nail on the head here is that it's an interesting moment in the US where, because of Trump's language about tariffs, there's this tendency to basically revert, even within center-left spaces, into a response that sounds almost like you're an opinion writer for The Economist, where that there's been a classic left critique of the inequities in the trade regime and the need essentially to transform a system built on footloose capital and constraints on labor, so that labor transnationally actually has control over the conditions of their own work life and production. And that's a transnational story that links labor in Central America and Mexico to labor in the United States. And I think one of the things that's been really destructive about right-wing politics is the capacity of Trump to articulate a class politics that's built on effectively promoting the perceived interests of, quote unquote, like, you know, nativist American labor to the detriment of workers that are part of like a broader global community. And so this feels like precisely a moment, as Luciana highlights, to think beyond the terms of just like the specific debate about protectionism, not protectionism, tariffs, not tariffs, to actually offer a full-throated alternative class account that's about how do you connect the interests transnationally of workers so that it's labor's position that's elevated rather than footloose capital.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aziz. My colleague Nick has been checking the chat and looking at the Q&A and kind of trying to group all the different questions. We only have 90 minutes. I wish this could go on for a couple more hours because I'm learning so much. But Nick, what salient questions have you found in the chat and in the Q&A?
Yeah, hi Sean. Hi everyone. There's some really good questions, and we're only going to get a chance to scratch a few of them. But perhaps I could start with you, Achin. There was a question particularly to you, which was just to pick up in your talk, what do you mean by progressive nationalisms, and isn't it fully compatible with imperialism? Was one of the questions. And there was also a question about what could be the strategy of small states to survive and maintain autonomy from big and middle powers which oppress them. So perhaps we could start with you, Achin, on those two.
Well, in the case of small states, it's really the question of having a new kind of regime, which is closely connected to its population, which is very much of a left kind, and therefore prepared to use the resources to be more independent and autonomous. In most of the smaller countries, you don't have that. You've had a certain period, for example, in Latin America, you had that, and you did have a progressive thing, and they were able to improve conditions. but then they had to resort to, for that period, Chavez and in Ecuador and so on, they had to resort to extractivist policies, which of course was not adequate in dealing that, but at least they were able to make changes, and there were efforts to actually connect at that time. So this is where that question of changes at the national level becomes important. Your other point was what was your other point about the importance of?
It was just how you were defining progressive nationalisms and whether it's
Well, it
compatible with
varies from
imperialism.
country to country. If you're talking about a progressive nationalism in an imperialist country, or a more progressive this thing here, well, one thing is that there are even differences between Western Europe, imperialist powers, and the United States, in the sense that there were certain progressive movements, progressive demands, welfare systems, greater degree of autonomy, referendum kind of approaches, deeper political democracies and all. But all this was always contingent on the balance of class forces between powers. And what I mean by this, and this is a question which connects, in fact, to what Luciana was saying, is that it is the politics and the changes in the political relationship of forces at the class level that has crucially influenced the direction that different governments, economic direction that different governments have taken place. In the case of the Great Depression, and then, of course, trying to get out of the Great Depression through war preparations, etc., greatly strengthened the working class in the United States of America, and of course, entry into the Second World War. The same thing in UK and elsewhere. And that shift in the relationship of forces between the rulers and the working class movement was a very important basis, alongside with what Aziz pointed out about the existence of the Soviet Union and that systemic divide, and actually having more progressive policies at the economic level. And then, of course, struggles politically and all like that is here. What happened with regard to the crisis that took place in the 70s of Keynesianism? That crisis came about in a period when the working class had been much more seriously defeated, and therefore enabling a shift from Keynesianism to neoliberalism. And then you have the crisis of neoliberalism, the Great Recession. But the difference between what happened after the Second World War and all is that the relationship of forces for having neoliberalism required a political shift that was very strong. And unfortunately, after the Great Repression, there is no shift in the relationship of political forces in favor of the working class movement. So in fact, you have many aspects of neoliberalism continue. And this is again the point where Luciana and Aziz have pointed out, in which, of course, don't just look at the question of tariffs and free trade and all, look at the question of finances and global movement of capital. Yeah. So you have a situation in which there are huge problems for the ruling elites in terms of how do they make more money and profits and all the rest. But the fact that there is no powerful struggle from below means that they don't have an answer. But it's up to us to actually have some kind of an answer and strengthen the relationship of forces. And in fact, ironically enough, shifting in a much greater direction the political relationship forces between labor and capital will probably require us to move in a direction in which we don't just challenge neoliberalism to make it, if you like, welfarist or Keynesian or more Keynesian or whatever, but we'd have to move towards, if you like, a break with capitalism. But that doesn't mean that the struggle for left populism, the struggle for greater welfarism, the struggle for greater democratization, all are not very, very important intermediate demands that can strengthen the relationship of forces so that we can move forward here. That's what I mean, if you like, by fighting at the national level for progressive changes with a progressive agenda here. But that's an intermediate step. If we have success there, then we're in a position to move even forward here. And I always say this, that no matter how progressive nationalism is, we have to have a progressive internationalism. And that means some kind of coordination mechanism, even among progressive forces operating on the national level, to address things like climate change, all sorts of other things that we have to do. And here also we are back away. Once upon a time, you had, for all its weaknesses, you had a Comintern International. You had among your social democratic parties a Socialist International. That's all gone. We have to also construct an international which is progressive. And these are two things that we really have to think about. So that's my longer term vision. Sorry.
Thank you, Achin. And to Ho-Fung, I've got, I mean, there's lots of questions, so perhaps you can make a choice of what you'd like to address. But and we're going to have a lot of time over the next 8 weeks to kind of delve into some of these issues a bit more. But some of the themes that came up was one was the role of IT and the tech sector, both in shaping particularly the autocratic trends that we're seeing right now in kind of increasing surveillance capitalism. Someone also raised, where does the ecological crisis fit into this? And that's not a theme we're going to be exploring again in more depth, but is obviously critical to this moment. And then some questions really about the kind of role of states in this moment, whether we're seeing a more fluid, both at an international level, a more kind of fluid hybrid move towards spheres of influence, but also some more fundamental questions that this is raising about the states and whether that's the best way to be organizing ourselves. So I was wondering if you wanted to pick up on one of those themes. We're not going to have time to address them all, or just to respond to some of Aziz and Achin's and Luciana's points.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will start with the question about the states, and actually that we always look at international politics and geopolitics from a perspective of the states, and but there are big states and small states, and now I always tend to see the current moment is a transition from a unipolar moment to a multipolar moment, that I'm with everybody else here to think that I think Achin also mentioned that this romanticization of the multipolar moment is problematic in the sense that it is not necessarily good, because the multipolar world can be a world of inter-imperial rivalry that we already saw it in the early 20th century that lead to World War. And also Cold War is also a kind of a bipolar moment of the world. The situation now is that very interesting that not many people noticed that the Bandung Conference was in 1955, April 18 to 24th. So we have just passed the 70th anniversary last week. The interesting thing is that no major states in the Global South want to highlight it and celebrate it. And in the 60th anniversary, in the 2015, I think some developing countries government talk about it and celebrate it, but now in 70th anniversary, just last week, that it's just like fly under the radar and not many fanfare about it, and so it speaks something that there's a speculation that, for example, Indonesia it should be the center of it, but it didn't talk about it. India didn't talk about it, and China have some like state media little article in like the page 20 of this official newspaper talk about it, but not many official mentioning. So it tells something that the Bandung is a kind of a movement of the Global South coming together against big global law of power. But now it's in the moment that supposed to be ripe for this Global South solidarity of these states from the Global South, but it didn't happen. One speculation of particular is that actually, like you look at Indonesia, even Cambodia, who is very dependent on China economically, but at the same time, they are actually very actively negotiating with the Trump administration about the trade tariff thing. Cambodia is very interesting because it's so dependent on China. There's a military levy port financed by China, and then right after Xi Jinping visited not long ago, and it welcomed a port call by 2 Japanese military ships, and then the Cambodian government is just saying that we are neutral. We are not siding definitely with one side or other, meaning that don't see us as a puppet of China, basically. So it is a kind of interesting time that many small states in the Global South, particularly in Asia and elsewhere, trying to survive and even take advantage of this increasing conflict between the U.S. and China to hedge one against the other, and then to maximize their space of autonomy. And I also agree with Achin that now the U.S.-China competition is very different from the old Cold War, Soviet Union and U.S. competition. Of course, that China has this pretension of the ruling party is still called the Communist Party of China, but in terms of its economic system, it is totally driven by profit motivation. And Xi Jinping many times mentioned welfare, race, lazy people. So we are not going to down to that path, and he's quite explicit about it. So it is very anti-welfare. And for a third country to decide to side with the US or China, it's not like in the old Cold War when you side with the Soviet Union. It means you need to adopt some kind of social political system, including nationalization, abolition of private property right. So many people will fight to the death to support it or to prevent it. So it is an existential choice to the elite of many developing countries to side with the US or the Soviet Union. But for many states in the developing world, in the global south nowadays, to decide between US and China is not that much an existential choice. You can shift back and forth between China and US. It just means who are your main investor or who are your main financiers of development project. It doesn't involve nationalization or choosing one socio-economic system over the other. So it's less existential choice. That actually, the silver lining of it is that it creates a room for global south countries to exercise autonomy, to play one against the other, to hedge one against the other. Of course, there's sometimes there's a kind of a conflict between geopolitical interests and economic interests. It is very clear. For example, Philippines economically is very have a good time since Duterte, from loan from China, investment from China. But at the same time, because of the South China Sea, now Philippines officially rename it West Philippine Sea. So Trump is not the first to rename this Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of what is it? Gulf of America, to rename the sea. So Philippines actually renamed South China Sea the West Philippine Sea. So there's China pressure on Philippines in terms of this maritime security and geopolitics is very heavy. So Philippines is definitely more pivoting back to the US, but at the same time, economically, it is still benefiting from China. So many developing countries are like that. Like Brazil, interestingly, the Worker Party people that they definitely geopolitically they want to be side with China against US hegemony, but at the same time that they worry about the China trade will create the China shock in Brazil to deindustrialize Brazil with China industrialized products. So they worry about that. So this create new crisis, but also new opportunity for many countries in the global south. I'm not particularly optimistic about solidarity among the states in the global south, but at the same time, for individual states in the global south, that actually it is up to each state and people to how to take advantage, or at least to prevent the polarization from getting too worse, too bad for them in terms of this U.S.-China competition. At the very last point I want to talk about is Luciana talk about trade deal that is very important. And NAFTA, how it destroyed American industry is very well known, and also to lead to the neoliberal turns in Mexico is also very well known. And something actually the Trump first administration did marginally good is this kind of a replacement of NAFTA with the USMCA that some people think that it is lip service, but it is a beginning of something that in the USMCA they have this labor standard cost built into that. So I think it is the beginning of something that we can think more about. That is tariff protectionism. Nowadays, we have a knee-jerk reaction against whatever Trump did and then think that every tariff, every protectionist measure is bad. But I want to emphasize that it's not all tariff and protectionist measures are bad. The question is how the organized labor and environmental movement, speaking of the ecological question, how to take advantage of this moment of tariff and protectionism is back in the world to gear that tariff and protectionism to a more progressive direction. For example, Europe already have this carbon tariff. Many countries are adopting it for climate change to kind of erect tariff against countries that export goods but has a high carbon intensity in the production process. And you can also argue about including the labor standard into all these trade agreement like USMCA. So there's an enforcement problem. It is half-baked, but actually we can go down that path to create a more progressive tariff and more progressive protectionism that solve or help solve a lot of labor issues and the environmental questions of our time. And we cannot afford shying away from this question of tariff and protectionism and to pretend that the old status quo of neoliberal free trade is good. So let me end here and look forward to more questions and discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ho-Fung. We're really running out of time, unfortunately. We had, I'm looking at 22 questions in the Q&A, so we might have to do a secondary webinar. But before we close, maybe I'll just ask, what are the fractures that movements can take advantage of now? Where's the light coming from? And what can we do to take advantage of this light? Luciana, I'll ask you to go 1 minute or 45 seconds if you can. And then after that, I'll ask Aziz. So just as short as you can, where's the light coming from? How can we increase those fractures? Go.
Yeah, it's the most difficult question because it's a moment of a lot of darkness. But I would say that crisis has always been the moment when we can reassess what's going on, and from there try to grab the people that are left behind in all this crisis. And we can get many of those people to our movements, to our spaces, if we understand what's going on. So it's very important that we have these discussions in order to have a diagnosis on what's going on and to talk to people with the idea of this is a corporate world. And in order to get out of that, to have a decarbonization, we need also deprivatization and decommodification. So in order to do that, there's only collective action that is possible. Otherwise, there's nothing to do. I mean, I don't believe in change through the state. So it's a huge discussion there. But I do think that we can reach out to people when we have that discourse that goes radical and deep into how people are getting their lives sucked by the system, right? So yeah, I would say that, which is really something that we have to deal on how we convert that into political strategies. That is the big question.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Aziz, where's the light coming in? What can we do?
So, first, thank you so much to all the organizers. Thank you to all it was wonderful to be part of this conversation, the questions that were presented. So, thinking from the US and then globally, it's still, again, really telling that the Trump and the people around Trump do not have a majority, let alone a supermajority coalition. They don't have policies that can be authorized and reauthorized through competitive elections. It's one of the reasons why they're trying to clamp down on the potential for competitive elections. But to the extent that there are competitive elections going forward, there'll be really profound sites of critique. And that's been bubbling up in the States, interestingly, not just through mass spontaneous activity, but through organized intermediate meaning-making institutions, unions, unions of professors even on campuses, professional associations of lawyers, professional associations of doctors, like churches, tenant groups, and that these are sites for culturally rebuilding a politics of the left in the US, and that can be nodes for an alternative vision that can build towards the types of transformation one might see. And it connects very directly to Achin's point about the need transnationally to do the same work of recreating intermediate meaning-making institutions that are not tied to the security infrastructure of the state, but that link various types of institutions cross-nationally for meaningful forms of political change. And it's the thing that's always been the foundation of left transformative politics. It was the foundation of the meaningful constraints that were placed on global capital over the course of the first two-thirds of the 20th century. It was the foundation for anti-colonialism, and it's the foundation today for meaningful change.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Aziz, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. Your insights have really shed some light right now. Thank you so much to the team that's been working behind the scenes, Jess, Twyla, Nick, the whole TNI machinery that has pulled together to bring this together. So this webinar has been recorded and will be posted to all those who registered. There will be 7 more sessions. Would like your feedback on this particular survey. So please, it helps us do things better if you fill in the survey. And our next session will go beyond the geopolitics to the liberal institutions and laws that have been part of the global infrastructure post-World War II. With what we're seeing, the genocide in Gaza, the flagrant disregard of international law by the United States and others, and the weakening of key global institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, we'll be asking what's the future for the liberal international order. So we've got a brilliant panel of activists and researchers, including Asli Ubali, who's a professor of international law at Yale Law School, Shahid Hamouri, who is with Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights, and Jomo Kwame Sundaram, former Assistant Secretary General at UNDSA. It will be co-moderated by Meena Jagannath from the Movement Law Lab. So this is going to be a really informative and useful session, and we're going to go deeper into all these different issues that have been raised today. So we'll leave the chat open. Please continue if you have anything else to add, and do register, spread the word. Let's get as many people to join this conversation so that we really start building this transnational internationalist movement that will redefine this moment. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please see the link to the survey in the chat.
Thanks so much again.